Hello and welcome. I'm Goblin, and tonight we are going to be reading ghost stories. The stories we're going to be reading are from my favorite website for first-hand paranormal experiences. It's called Your Ghost Stories. And the subject matter we will be reading about tonight are non-human entities. But first, before we get to that, I just wanted to drop by and mention that it has been 1 year since I started making these videos. And it's been so much fun for me to put them together. I really enjoy it. And I think it's really cool that people will watch them or listen to them or whatever it may be. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for watching and thank you for tuning in tonight. As I said, tonight we will be reading stories about non-human entities. You see, the stories on Your Ghost Stories are divided into categories based on their subject matter. And one of the categories is non-human entities. And it's one of my favorite categories on the website because it has some of the strangest and most interesting tales on the website. You may think that experiences with the paranormal is restricted to ghostly apparitions, a misty form, a disembodied footstep, but you're wrong. It gets much stranger. So, if all that sounds good to you, let's get started. The first encounter we are going to read is by Caitlin A93 from Iowa, and it's called Weird Forest Encounter. I've had a lot of encounters with ghosts, but this one is a little different. Different because I'm not sure what exactly was encountered, but I'm hoping maybe someone can read this and shed a little light on this experience. This was when I was about 17. I was hanging out with my boyfriend at the time and one of his friends. His friend was a pretty outdoorsy kind of guy. He wasn't scared of much, he grew up hunting and was always out exploring the woods at all hours. Living in a small town with a lot of parks and surrounded by wooded areas, there wasn't a lot to do, so exploring the woods was a typical thing for really any of us to do. I never used to be afraid of the woods until after this experience. This particular night, his friend decided that he wanted to go spotlight hunting. We drove out to an area on a gravel road in my boyfriend's car. There used to be a bridge that went across the river, but it was burnt and eventually torn down, so it was closed off, and the end of the gravel had become overgrown with grass, weeds, and such. There's a tall bridge off in the distance. We were out there, miles away from any town and any houses. We found a place to pull over, near the end of the gravel, and my boyfriend and his friend grabbed the rifle out of the trunk and their flashlight. Being an animal lover, I didn't feel like taking part, so I chose to stay in the car. Before my boyfriend took off into the field, he told me to give them 15 minutes, and if they didn't come back, I could take his car and leave them. With that, they disappeared into the dark. So there I was, sitting in his car. There was a metal railing in front of the car that we had pulled up to, which the guys had to climb over. On both sides of the car there was tall grass, taller than the car. It was a bit spooky, but I tried to keep my mind busy. I turned on the radio and waited. 15 minutes went by, and they still weren't back. I hadn't heard any gunshots, so I figured maybe they just weren't having any luck. Then I got this weird feeling. The feeling of being watched. I tried to play it off as my nerves. I look out my window to the right and I see the tall grass moving. I told myself it was the wind. I look out the driver's side window. The grass over there stood still. I've seen enough horror movies to know that I didn't want to look out the right window again. Ignorance is bliss, right? I look down at my phone and do everything I can to not look up. Scared I might see something I didn't want to see. Then, something hit the back of the car, pretty hard. I look back, but with the tint and the darkness, it was impossible to see anything. So I checked the locks to make sure I was safe and turned up the radio. The knocking on the trunk in the back window continued on and off. At this point, it had been an hour since they had left, and I was hoping it was just them trying to play a joke on me. I knew I couldn't leave them out there, and there was no way I was getting out of the car, so there I sat, trying to ignore whatever was out there. The knocks soon turned to shaking the car. I shrank down in my seat and just kept my eyes on my phone, waiting for the guys to get back. After about 15 minutes, the banging stopped, and I was left in silence when I hear the guys yelling. I sat up, flipped on the headlights to see my boyfriend, who had never touched a gun in his life, running towards the car, cradling the rifle in his arms and vaulting over the metal railing. His friend came running soon after. I unlocked the doors. My boyfriend jumped in the driver's seat, throwing the gun in the backseat, where his friend was scrambling to get in, yelling, "Go, go, go!" He quickly backed out and we sped off down the gravel road. My boyfriend's face was filled with terror and he starts yelling at his friend. What the hell was that, man? His friend is looking out the back window, terrified, and exclaimed, "It's following us." I was both scared and confused. I kept asking what they were talking about and what happened, but they were too busy trying to calm down. We sped as fast as his car could go back towards town. Once it was clear and we were safe, I asked again what happened, only to be told they don't want to talk about it. We eventually get back into town and pull up to his friend's house. We all just sat there in silence for a minute. Both guys looked almost paralyzed, trying to figure out what they had seen. His friend finally spoke, admitting that after whatever they encountered, he was scared to even be home alone. Reluctantly, he got out of the car, grabbed his rifle, and headed inside. I questioned my boyfriend for the next several days, but he always just got a weird look on his face and would shake his head, like he didn't believe in himself. It was apparent I would never know, and I guess a part of me was okay with that, so I stopped asking and life went on. 9 years later, I got the answer. Like most high school relationships, my boyfriend from back then and I have been broken up for a long time, and I'm actually married now with 2 kids and 1 on the way. Well, it just so happens that my husband had this guy start working with him. It took a couple of weeks and on-the-job stories from my husband to realize that this guy was the friend of my boyfriend all those years ago. I decided to open up to my husband and tell him about this horrifying experience we all had back then. I suggested that maybe he text the guy that he worked with, the friend of my ex, and ask him about that night. He did, and the response was not what I was expecting. He got a reply, and the guy explained how that night haunts him. He told him how they were in the field, not having much luck. They heard a whole bunch of birds in the grass suddenly take flight, making a ruckus and giving the guys a bit of a jump. They went over to the area with the flashlight on, and that's when they saw him. He said he was unusually tall and very skinny and lanky, as well as very pale. It was odd enough to see anyone out there at that time of night, let alone being out in a large field lined with forest. He just didn't belong. He then went on to say that the weirdest thing about this guy was his voice. It was very abnormal and unexpectedly high-pitched, like a child. What did the guy say? Well, this is the part that still sends shivers down my spine. Apparently, he said, "You might want to check on that girl you left back in the car." This friend described how they ran back through the field, across a ditch, and back to the car. He said they were running as fast as they could and this guy was running parallel to them, but through the wooded area, a much harder route, and yet he was keeping perfect balance with them. The trees and terrain didn't slow him at all as they sprinted back to me in the car. That's when we had started speeding back home. He said when he looked back, he saw the guys step over the metal barrier next to the road. They had to vault or climb over it, but this guy stepped over it like it was nothing. So here I am. My story has finally concluded after 9 years. Although I've tried researching similar encounters, I can't find anything. The only thing I know for sure is whatever it wasn't human. That was a long one, but a really good one, don't you think? Unfortunately, like our author, I have no idea what this creature might have been, as is the case with all of the stories we are reading tonight. That's what makes these stories so interesting and so creepy. So, since I don't have any musings on folklore or urban legend, I'll just compile as many stories as I can for you. So sit back, relax, turn out the lights, and enjoy the show. Next, we'll read a short one from NXS Gal in Tennessee. It's called The Paper Man. About 10 years ago, when I was around 42, my husband and I divorced and I was living in an apartment alone. It was my day off, and that afternoon I decided to stretch out on the couch and relax for a bit. I turned my TV on and got comfortable. I looked at the end of the couch, at my feet, and there stood a small man. He was very short, wore no clothes, and had no hair. His left hand rested on the end of the couch, and his right hand was near his face, with a finger on his cheek, like he was studying me. But his skin, the only way I can describe it, was like old parchment paper, wrinkled and old-looking. I'm not really sure how to give a description. I can remember no details about his face. It seemed like his eyes were the only thing I was aware of. I said in a low, quiet voice, "What do you want?" And he said nothing. Then I said, "Go away," and he was gone. I was afraid to move and just felt cold and numb all over. My adrenaline was pumping like crazy. It is 10 years or more later, and I still feel terror thinking about it. It had a huge effect on me. I thought maybe I had fallen asleep and dreamed it, but I do not believe that happened. It is as real today as it was then. It's probably impossible to know what we would say if we found ourselves in a situation like this, but what would you say to the paper man? To me, he sounds kind of cute, but if I imagine myself laying on the couch at night by myself and then looking down to see the paper man at my feet, I'd probably be a little freaked out too. Our next story takes place in California and is written by user Unforgiven1. It's called Strange Experience in the Parking Lot. This took place around 16 years ago. Before I moved to Norway, I lived in Southern California where I was born and raised and where the incident took place. I'm not exactly sure if I was 16 or 17 years old at the time, but it was somewhere around there. I'm close with my mom and my grandma, and we lived together at this time. In the afternoons, it was common that we would run our errands together and maybe pick up dinner before going back home. One afternoon, I went along with my grandma on a trip to the pharmacy. The pharmacy was in a strip mall shopping center that we visited often because our bank, grocery store, and favorite Chinese food place were also located there. This afternoon, I sat in the passenger seat on my grandma's car while she went inside the pharmacy. It was still daylight, and the parking lot had a normal amount of cars and people walking into the stores. The parking spots nearest to the side of the car I was sitting on were not taken, so there were probably 2 or 3 empty spaces next to me. While I was sitting in the car, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye, so I turned my head and saw something standing in an empty spot a few places over from our car. What I saw shocked me. It was a very tall figure, maybe 8 feet tall. It resembled a human male, except the face had no distinguishing features other than looking extremely melted. This is the part I find difficult to explain. The face wasn't melted as in dripping looking. It looked more like a peach color, melted wax or plastic face. I don't remember seeing eyes, just places where eyes should be. It also had a very high and unnatural hairline. The hair it had resembled an extremely frizzy Brillo pad wig that was melted or burned onto the head. I do not remember what it was wearing. It was standing there and waving excitedly at me. Its arms were just waving eagerly at me, like it was a friend who was excited to see me. The moment I looked at it, I was so shocked and scared that I immediately looked away. I had a horrible feeling from seeing it, but mostly I was stunned. When I turned my head away from it, it was immediately at my window. It didn't walk or run, it was just suddenly there in an instant. I was looking straight ahead while it was there at my window. It seemed to be bent over at the waist, and its face was really close to the glass. It was still waving its hand in an annoying and crazed greeting. I didn't know what to do. The fear felt like a punch to the gut. I was a dumb teenager, so I pretended to be changing the radio channel, ignoring it. After a moment, I didn't see it in the corner of my eye at the window. I turned my head to look. Nothing there. I locked the car door and looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing there. I looked all around the parking lot from inside the car. Nothing. If it were a person, I should have been able to see it walking away from the car or walking into a store. This thing had just vanished. I was so freaked out that I became emotional and started crying. My grandma came back to the car from the pharmacy and I told her what happened. She could see that I was obviously upset. She listened to what happened as we drove home. When we arrived home, I went straight to my mom and told her what happened too. I was still in tears and she comforted me. They both believed me, but I could barely believe it myself. I've had a hard time telling the story for a long time because I would become teary trying to tell it. It was scary, and it was such an uncomfortable feeling to see someone that I know could not be human. I don't know what that thing was. We continued to run our errands at the shopping center, but I never sat alone in the car again. I also remember declining to join my mom on a late-night trip to the pharmacy just some years ago because it would be dark and I don't want to see anything like it again. A few things that I remember that I want to add. I've been around this shopping center my whole life, and I have not heard of anyone having any unusual incidents there. It is not a creepy place, it's just a buzzing little strip mall. It was not a person in a costume. The figure was way too tall and was way too fast when it teleported or whatever to my window. When it was at the window, it seemed to be smiling. I wouldn't look directly at it when I was at the window, but I saw its expression in the corner of my eye. I'm not afraid of clowns, but it did seem clownish in behavior. For example, the way it was waving at me furiously and smiling. The figure was not see-through, misty, or anything ghostly. Just extremely real and horrifying to look at, and not of this world. What a bizarre experience. Super creepy and unnerving. You'd normally expect to have this sort of encounter at nighttime, in a secluded area, not in broad daylight, in the middle of a shopping center parking lot. But strange creatures can make appearances anywhere, even the kitchen. The next two stories are pretty short, but they both feature non-human entities in the kitchen. The first one is by the Losh 77 in Maine, and it's called Faceless Gray Creature. One night, my family and I were eating dinner, and my back was to the kitchen. It sounded like a cutting board fell out of the cabinet behind me, and I didn't think much of it. However, my mom looked over and screamed, so I turned to look and hunched on all fours. I saw a very thin, gray creature. It looked as if its tight, ashen skin was covering the features of its face, including its large mouth. It looked like it had arms, but was standing on all fours. All the skin on its body was tight and gray. When I think back to it, I don't recall feeling senses of evil. I just felt curious. When I saw the creature, I screamed and jumped over the table and got ready to throw my glass at it, but when I looked back, it was gone. When my mom asked why I jumped over the table, I told her what I saw. She seemed a little concerned, and she told me she screamed because she saw a mouse, along with everyone else at the table. I don't know why I was the only one who saw what I saw, and I don't know why it didn't stay. Very strange that the author of this story saw this creepy little gray creature and everyone else in the room saw a mouse. Let's read another quick story about a critter in the kitchen. This one takes place in California and was submitted by user Tiger Wolf. It's called Kitchen Creature. Two nights ago, I was doing the dishes in our kitchen. It was approximately 4 a.m. My parents and brother were asleep, but my two sisters were awake. They were in the office at the front of our house though, good distance from the kitchen. We don't have a dishwasher, so I was working on scrubbing a broiler pan by hand, was very focused on the work. It's important to note that I was not sleepy in the slightest. I'm a night person, naturally, and I find it easiest to sleep between 6 a.m. and 3 p.m. and be up the rest of the time. I take night classes in college because of this. In our house, there are also 7 cats. So when I felt a cat rubbing up against my legs, I didn't look down at first. It was probably just our orange tabby, Ziggy, thinking that I had food to give him. The bumping became more insistent, and I sighed. I didn't want to nudge him away, so I looked down, intending to tell him to go away. However, what I saw was most certainly not any of our cats. It was about the size of a cat, but its body was so solid black that it looked as if it was swallowing the light around it, and looking at me were 2 glowing red eyes. However, the most terrifying part of all of this was the head. In the blackness of the body, it was stark white. It was a skull. I have a lot of experience with skulls as a paleontologist in training, and I can tell you, it was not a normal small mammal skull. It had aspects of a primate skull, but also aspects of a skunk or raccoon skull. It wasn't feline or canine at all. I choked, unable to scream, and leapt back away from the sink, slamming into the stove behind me, almost knocking another dirty pan onto the floor. My eyes found the area the thing had been, but it was gone. I looked around the kitchen, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. What a strange little being. The author took care to mention that even though it was late at night, they had all the lights on in the kitchen so they could make sure the dishes were clean. So, they are sure of what they saw. The next story is from Arizona, and it is written by user Eternal Lotus. It's called White Man in the Bushes. I encountered this entity while walking my dog. This experience stays fresh in my mind no matter how many days come to pass, and it still leaves me uneasy. It was on a clear night with a full moon that I decided to take my dog on a walk due to not being able to fall back asleep. I pulled on a simple jacket to keep me warm in my shirt and pajama pants, leashed up my dog, and left my home quietly as my family slept. It was in the early morning hours, and I thought that it was just going to be a simple walk down the end of the street and back. It was silent as I made my way down our dirt road. Not even the birds were making noises in the trees as I walked past. My dog Tess would let out an uneasy whine every now and again, but I just took it as her being the scaredy dog she was probably whining about her own shadow. As we neared the end of the street, only about 10 or so feet away from the mailbox, she started moving closer to me, and I felt my vision almost vibrate as I turned my head. I suddenly felt like something was pressing down on me, while a loud buzzing filled my head. I don't know why, but at the same time I glanced to the side and saw something standing in the bushes on the side of the road. It looked like a man, and yet not. It had no clothes on and was tall, with rather long limbs and sickly white skin that just the sight alone almost made me want to throw up. The thing's face is what scared me the most, for it had no nose but piercing yellow eyes and a leering grin on its wide mouth that almost splits its face from ear to ear. Other than these features and its body shape, there was nothing else to identify it as male. Not that I really had time to double check, as it disappeared and the pressure and buzzing noise went away. Once it did, I could hear my dog freaking out as she tried to slip out of her leash and whined loudly. I quickly turned and ran back home with her. Once I was home and in my room, I instantly jumped back into bed and pulled the blankets over my head to feel safe again, as I realized just how much that thing had scared me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, nor have I seen it again, but thinking back on my experience, I don't think I want to. Yeah, I think seeing a man in the bushes is going to be creepy regardless, but especially a naked one with gross white skin, long limbs, and piercing yellow eyes, and a leering grin. Why do they always have the leering grin? Maybe we're getting a bad read on these non-human entities and they're actually all really quite friendly. Let's move on to our next story. This next experience is by Allison Beckert, 23, and it takes place in the state of Utah. It's called Creeper at the Door. I was in a building full of classrooms in Provo, Utah, which was open after dark for study. There were about 10 of us studying in a room and getting ready to leave. I got up with a friend to fill up my water bottle at a fountain just down the hall. Other rooms were empty and the doors all closed, but the room just behind and to the left of the fountain had its door just barely cracked open, about 3 inches. While we walked past it to return to our friends, I caught a glimpse of something that terrified me. It was a hand just wrapping around the door and a face coming to peek out of the dark room. Short and just barely at the height of the door handle. Whatever it was had a kind of gray-green color, and from the briefest glance I caught of it, the eyes seemed yellow-blue. Not green, but yellow with a weird blue about it. It felt decidedly negative and malicious, and at the same time, I felt coaxed toward it, but there was no way, ever, that I would have gone to investigate it. I didn't tell my friend, but instead asked a couple of guys in our group if they would just do me a simple favor and go close the door. They didn't get why I was so scared, but I just said I would feel a lot better if they would just go close the door all the way before we left. They did, and I didn't feel anything weird there. That story was short and simple, but I found it to be particularly creepy. I think it has to do with the setting, being in a school. It's the last place you'd expect to see such a strange creature. There's another great little story about a bizarre creature sighting in a school in the Goblins Part 2 video. It's the second story in that video, so definitely check that one out if you are interested. But for now, it's time to read the final story I have for you. It's written by user Max Sharp from Washington, and it's called Not an Animal, Not a Person. In the spring of 2008, my family moved into a townhouse in a quiet cul-de-sac in Centralia, Washington. My daughters, aged 16 and 12 at the time, shared bunk beds in a bedroom that overlooked several neighbors' backyards, the training yard of a dog training facility, and several acres of horse pasture, with a distant view of the back end of a park. My youngest daughter had taken the top bunk and was next to the window, which, at the time, had not been given window treatments. As soon as the mornings began to get lighter, around 5 a.m., she complained of seeing 4 small, dark creatures passing from the garage side of our house, hopping our back fence, and traveling along the neighbor's fence before disappearing around the edge of the fence. She was insistent that we get window treatments right away, as she felt incapable of not looking at the creatures when she was awakened by their presence. She described them as approximately 2 to 3 feet tall, with long arms, traveling at a jog hunched over. That they frightened her was obvious. I asked her if they jumped over our fence or went through it. She said they physically jumped over the fence, sort of a vaulting motion. I was a bow hunter for a number of years, and I know how to track animals. I checked the lawn for footprints. There were none. I checked the path she described them as taking each day. It is a path that would not have been traveled by anything else, and there should have been obvious signs of the passage of the creatures such as she described, but there was nothing. Nothing on the fence, nothing in the grass, and the neighbors thought I was crazy for asking if they saw anything. After several more times of seeing these creatures, the same time each morning, the last creature in line, just before disappearing around the neighbor's fence, would pause and slowly look back and up into our daughter's window, looking right at her. After the second time of this happening, she put a large piece of poster board that had been a science project across the window until we put blinds and curtains up. I asked why she didn't come get us or her sister when this would happen. She claimed to be unable to move when she saw them. Not scared stiff, but physically unable to move. That was much of what was scaring her about the encounters. She was so insistent that the creatures did not have a friendly feel to them. She described them as feeling dark, My wife and I and her sister are the only people she has ever told about these encounters. It was easy for us to believe she was telling the truth because she has no history of crazy stories with us or her friends. Her fright and her insistence on covering the windows were genuine, and she has never changed her story. I really enjoyed that story. What do you think of the author's daughter's experience? It could have been a dream, or episodes of sleep paralysis, but it'd be pretty unusual to have the same exact dream night after night, don't you think? Who knows what's creeping about, weaving through our neighborhoods in the wee hours of the morning? There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. I hope you enjoyed the stories tonight. These experiences were unique, but if you think these are the only encounters people have had with bizarre, non-human entities, you're wrong. There will definitely be more to come. Until next time.